They're
The
coming.
autumn wind swept across the lonely
Keep 'em
plains
away,
of
Boone.
Wyoming
Let's
territory,
go.
carrying dust through the weathered fences
Let's
of
go.
Emma Carter's small ranch. The once thriving homestead had become a quiet place where only the cries of hawks and the creak of old wooden boards disturbed the silence. Emma was only 28, but grief had added years to her face. 3 years earlier, her husband, Samuel, had died while driving cattle through a flooded river. Since then, she had lived alone with only her faithful horse, Daisy, and an aging sheepdog named Boone. Every morning before sunrise, Emma hauled water from the creek, repaired broken fences, and tended the few cattle she had left. Neighbors admired her determination, but few offered help. Everyone had their own hardships in the Wild West. The nearest town, Red Creek, lay nearly 10 miles away. Emma visited only once a month for supplies. She preferred the quiet of her ranch, though loneliness often settled over her like the cold evening mist. One crisp afternoon, Emma noticed fresh horse tracks leading toward her property. She frowned. Travelers rarely came this far. She tightened her grip on the bucket she carried and scanned the horizon. 3 riders appeared over a distant ridge. Their horses moved slowly, deliberately. Even from afar, Emma could tell they weren't ranchers. Dark coats. Wide-brimmed hats. Rifles hanging from their saddles. Her heartbeat quickened. The riders stopped at her gate. The tallest among them smiled without warmth. "Afternoon, ma'am." Emma forced herself to remain calm. "Can I help you?" The man removed his gloves. "We heard this ranch belongs to a widow." "It does. Must be difficult managing it all alone." "I manage." The men exchanged amused glances. "We're interested in buying your land." "It's not for sale." The smile disappeared. "Everything's for sale." Emma stepped backward. "I said no." For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Finally the leader chuckled. "We'll come back when you've had time to think." The 3 riders turned and disappeared into the hills. Emma remained frozen until they vanished completely. Something inside her whispered that they weren't coming back to negotiate. They were coming back to take. That evening, she locked every door and window. Boone refused to stop growling toward the darkness beyond the ranch. The old dog sensed danger long before humans did. Emma loaded Samuel's old revolver. She wasn't a skilled shooter. She prayed she wouldn't have to be. As night settled across the prairie, distant thunder rolled over the mountains. Unseen by Emma, another horseman watched the ranch from a rocky ridge nearly half a mile away. He wore a faded gray duster. A weather-beaten hat hid most of his face. Across his back rested an old Winchester rifle. He spoke to no one. Moved like a shadow. And quietly observed everything. The silent stranger watched the widow's lonely cabin until the moon climbed high above the valley. Then, without a sound, he disappeared into the darkness. The next morning arrived beneath a pale golden sunrise. Dew clung to the prairie grass as Emma Carter stepped outside with a weary sigh. Although she had slept little, the ranch still demanded her attention. Cattle needed feeding, fences needed repairing, and life on the frontier never paused for fear. Yet the memory of the 3 bandits lingered in her mind. Every few minutes she glanced toward the distant hills. Nothing. Only empty prairie. Still, Boone refused to leave her side. As Emma repaired a broken fence near the creek, she noticed fresh hoofprints in the soft earth. They were different from the bandits' tracks, only one horse had passed, and whoever rode it knew how to leave almost no trace. She quietly rested a hand on the revolver at her belt. "Who's there?" she called. Silence answered. Then, from behind a cluster of cottonwood trees, a lone rider emerged. His horse was dark as midnight, moving with calm confidence. The rider wore a faded gray duster coated in trail dust. A weathered hat shaded his face, and a Winchester rifle rested across his saddle. He stopped several yards away. Neither spoke. Emma studied him carefully. He wasn't dressed like a rancher. Nor like a lawman. His face carried old scars, but his eyes were calm, watchful rather than threatening. Finally, he tipped his hat. "Morning." His voice was low and steady. Emma didn't lower her guard. "What brings you here?" "I saw riders visiting yesterday." She stiffened. "You were watching?" "I was passing through." "Those men aren't welcome here." "I know." His words were few, but somehow reassuring. He noticed the damaged fence. Without asking permission, he dismounted, picked up a spare post lying nearby, and began setting it firmly into the ground. Emma frowned. "You don't have to do that." "I know." Within minutes, he had repaired what would have taken Emma nearly an hour. His movements were efficient, practiced, almost effortless. "You've done ranch work before," she observed. "A long time ago." "You have a name?" He paused. "Luke." "Just Luke?" He gave the faintest hint of a smile. "That's enough." Emma couldn't explain why, but she believed him. Not because he looked harmless, he clearly wasn't, but because there was no greed or cruelty in his eyes. After finishing the fence, Luke brushed the dirt from his hands. "You should keep your animals close tonight." Emma's stomach tightened. "You think they'll return?" "They will." "How do you know?" "I've seen men like them." He mounted his horse. "Where are you going?" "North." "You have family there?" "No." "Then why help me?" Luke looked toward the distant mountains before answering. "Someone once helped me." With that, he gently nudged his horse forward and rode away.
Morning!
Emma watched until he disappeared beyond the hills. That afternoon, she traveled into Red Creek for supplies. The small frontier town buzzed with wagons, horses, and ranchers finishing their weekly business. Inside the general store, whispers spread quickly when Emma mentioned the three strangers. Old Mr. Jenkins shook his head. "They've been causing trouble all across the county." "What do they want?" "Land." "They're forcing people to sell?" "Worse. They threaten folks until they leave." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. Sheriff Tom Walker entered the store carrying a stack of wanted notices. "I heard your visitors came calling. They offered to buy my ranch. They're the Carson gang. Can you stop them?" The sheriff sighed. "They keep crossing county lines before we can catch them. So I'm on my own. For now." His answer offered little comfort. As sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and crimson, Emma hurried back toward her ranch. Halfway home, Boone suddenly barked. 3 distant riders appeared on the ridge. The Carson gang had returned. Emma urged Daisy into a gallop. The bandits followed, laughing as they closed the distance. Her horse thundered across the open prairie. The ranch was still nearly half a mile away. One outlaw fired a warning shot into the air. Another shouted, "Run all you want, widow. Tomorrow this land belongs to us." Emma's heart pounded. The riders gained ground. Just as they were about to surround her, a single rifle shot echoed across the valley. Crack! The lead bandit's hat flew clean off his head. The bullet had missed him by less than an inch. Every rider froze. On a rocky ridge overlooking the valley sat one lone horseman. Luke. He calmly worked the rifle's lever. Without a word. Without another movement. His steady aim said everything. The bandits exchanged uneasy glances. The leader slowly smiled, though the confidence had vanished from his face. "This isn't over," he called. Then, one by one, the outlaws turned their horses and disappeared into the gathering darkness. Emma stared toward the ridge. Luke simply lowered his rifle, turned his horse, and vanished into the shadows once again. For the second time, the mysterious gunslinger had appeared exactly when she needed him. And for the first time in years, Emma felt she might not have to face the coming storm alone. The morning after the warning shot, the ranch was unusually still.
You're surrounded!
A cool breeze carried the scent of sage across the prairie, and the first rays of sunlight painted the mountains in shades of gold. Emma stepped onto her porch, expecting another day of uncertainty. Instead, she found something unexpected. A fresh stack of firewood rested neatly beside the cabin door. The broken latch on her barn had been repaired. Even the loose gate that had troubled her for weeks now swung smoothly on its hinges. She looked around the empty yard. No one. But somehow, she already knew who had done it. "Luke," she whispered. Boone wagged his tail toward the distant hills, as if agreeing. Later that morning, Emma rode to the creek to fill water barrels. As she rounded a bend, she spotted Luke kneeling beside the stream, washing blood from a deep cut on his left arm. He looked up calmly but made no move for his rifle. "You've been hurt," Emma said. "It's nothing." She dismounted anyway. "It doesn't look like nothing." Luke tried to pull his sleeve down, but Emma stopped him. The wound was fresh, likely from a grazing bullet. "One of the bandits?" He nodded once. "They fired after leaving." "You never told me." "There wasn't time." Emma opened the small medical pouch she carried for her livestock. "I may not be a doctor, but I can clean a wound." For the first time, Luke hesitated. Then he quietly sat on a nearby rock. Emma gently washed the cut with cool water. Luke never flinched, though she knew it must have stung. "You don't talk much," she said. "No. Were you always this quiet?" A long silence passed. "No." She glanced at him. "What changed?" Luke stared into the flowing creek. "I learned silence lasts longer than promises." Emma didn't ask another question. Some wounds were deeper than the ones people could see. As they rode back toward the ranch together, Emma noticed something remarkable. Birds landed near Luke's horse without fear. Even Boone trotted happily beside him. Animals trusted him. People probably should too. When they reached the ranch, Luke paused. "You should leave." Emma frowned. "What?" "The Carson gang will come back with more men. This is my home. They won't stop. Neither will I." Luke looked directly at her. "You could die." Emma's voice softened. "My husband built this ranch with his own hands." She looked toward the weathered barn. "We dreamed of raising children here." Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "If I leave, I lose him all over again." Luke lowered his gaze. For the first time, he truly understood why she stayed. That evening, clouds gathered across the western sky. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Emma prepared supper. Just as she placed 2 bowls on the table, she realized what she had done. She had set a place for Luke. He noticed. "I wasn't staying." "You can if you'd like." He hesitated.
Get out of here!
"I haven't shared a meal with anyone in years."
Luke,
"Then maybe
no!
it's time." For a moment, the lonely cabin felt less empty. They ate mostly in silence. Yet somehow, it wasn't uncomfortable. Emma learned Luke preferred black coffee, homemade bread, and quiet evenings. Luke learned Emma laughed softly whenever Boone begged for scraps beneath the table. It was the first peaceful night either of them had enjoyed in a long time. The peace didn't last. Near midnight, Boone's deep growl shattered the silence. Luke was on his feet instantly. He stepped onto the porch and listened. Hoofbeats. Many of them. Not 3. At least 8 riders approached through the darkness. Torchlight flickered across the hills. The Carson gang had returned. This time, they hadn't come to negotiate. They had come for war. Luke calmly loaded fresh cartridges into his Winchester. Emma gripped Samuel's old revolver with trembling hands. The bandits surrounded the ranch, their horses forming a dark ring around the property. Their leader shouted through the night. "Last chance, widow. Walk away, and you live." Emma stepped onto the porch beside Luke. Her voice was steady. "No." The outlaw laughed. "Then we'll burn everything you own." Luke slowly stepped forward. The firelight revealed his scarred face. His expression never changed. The gang leader suddenly stopped laughing. His eyes widened with recognition. It can't be." One of the younger outlaws whispered nervously. "Boss, that's him. The Ghost Gunslinger." Fear spread through the gang like wildfire. Even the horses seemed restless. Luke rested one hand near his revolver. His calm voice cut through the silence. "You've got one chance. Ride away." No one moved. The storm broke overhead. Lightning flashed across the sky. Rain began to fall. And every man knew the next heartbeat could decide who lived until sunrise.
Keep
Lightning
back!
split the sky as
Get outta
heavy
here!
rain poured over Emma Carter's ranch.
Let's go!
The wind howled through the old barn, and the torches carried by the Carson gang hissed in the downpour. 8 armed riders surrounded the property, their horses stamping nervously in the mud. Emma stood on the porch beside Luke, her hands trembling around Samuel's old revolver. She had never faced this many armed men before. Luke, however, remained perfectly still. His gray duster fluttered in the wind, and his eyes never left the gang leader. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Finally, Carson forced a laugh. "So, the stories are true." Luke said nothing. "I heard you were dead." Silence. "I've been looking for you for years." Luke's voice was calm. "You should have stopped." Carson's smile faded. "You remember Silver Pass?" Luke's expression hardened. "I remember innocent families. I remember burning homes. I remember children crying." The rain fell harder. Emma looked at Luke in surprise. She had never heard him speak so many words. Years ago, Luke had been one of the fastest lawmen in the territory. He and a small group of marshals had hunted outlaw gangs across the frontier. At Silver Pass, Carson and his men had ambushed them, burning the town to cover their escape. Luke had survived. Most of his friends had not. Since that day, he had disappeared from the world, becoming nothing more than a legend whispered around campfires. The Ghost Gunslinger, people called him. Not because he sought revenge, but because he appeared wherever innocent people needed protecting. Carson slowly drew his revolver. "You should have stayed buried." Luke answered quietly. "So should your crimes." The outlaw fired. The shot echoed across the valley. Before Emma could even blink, Luke moved. His revolver cleared its holster like lightning. Bang! Carson's gun spun from his hand, landing in the mud several yards away. The bandits stared in disbelief. Luke had fired only once. He hadn't hit Carson. He had shot the revolver clean out of his hand. The message was clear. He could have ended the fight already. He chose mercy. Carson clutched his bleeding wrist and shouted, "Kill them!" The outlaws charged. Gunfire erupted across the ranch. Bullets slammed into fence posts and barn walls. Emma ducked behind a water trough while Luke moved with incredible speed, using wagons and fences as cover. Every shot he fired had purpose. One outlaw's rifle shattered. Another's saddle strap snapped, sending him tumbling into the mud. A third lost his hat as a bullet clipped its brim. Luke never fired to kill. He fired to stop. Emma remembered Samuel's old hunting lessons. Taking a deep breath, she steadied her shaking hands and fired at a lantern hanging from a wagon. The glass exploded. Darkness swallowed half the ranch. The bandits suddenly couldn't see one another.
You best put that
Confusion
down.
spread through their ranks.
Get out of
"Hold
here!
your fire!" Carson yelled. But it was too late. Two frightened outlaws accidentally collided with each other, falling into the muddy yard. Luke seized the opportunity. He sprinted across the rain-soaked ground, reached the horses tied near the gate, and slapped them free. The startled animals bolted into the storm. Without horses, the gang's escape would become much harder. Carson cursed loudly. "You fool!" Luke stood between the outlaws and Emma's cabin, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. His revolver lowered slightly. "You still have a choice. Leave." For a moment, even Carson hesitated. He looked at his frightened men. 3 were injured. 2 had lost their horses. The rest no longer looked eager to fight the legendary Ghost Gunslinger. Carson knew the battle had already slipped from his grasp. He backed away slowly, hatred burning in his eyes. "This isn't finished." Luke replied with the same quiet certainty that had unsettled the gang from the beginning. "It is." Carson gave one final glare before ordering his men to retreat into the storm. Within moments, the pounding hoofbeats faded into the darkness, leaving only the sound of rain falling on the lonely ranch. Emma lowered her revolver, her heart still racing. She turned to thank Luke, but he was already walking toward the gate, scanning the horizon. The danger had passed for the night. But deep inside, both of them knew the Carson gang would not forget this defeat. Their final reckoning was still to come.
The
storm drifted east before dawn, leaving the prairie washed
With the sheriff
clean.
and neighbors, it'll be done in
Mist
no time.
rose from the fields as the
beginning.
first
To a new
rays of
beginning.
sunlight touched Emma Carter's ranch. Broken fence rails, scattered wagon tracks, and deep hoofprints were the only reminders of the night's battle. Emma stepped onto the porch carrying 2 cups of hot coffee. Luke was already awake. He stood beside the corral, quietly repairing a section of fence the bandits had smashed. His left arm was stiff from the old wound, but he worked without complaint. "You should rest," Emma said, offering him a cup. "I'll rest later." "You always say that. When there's work to do." Emma smiled faintly. "Then today, we'll work together." For the next several hours, they rebuilt the ranch side by side. Luke repaired gates, lifted heavy beams, and mended the corral. Emma gathered frightened cattle, patched the barn roof, and cleaned the yard. For the first time since Samuel's death, the ranch no longer felt like a place of sorrow. It felt alive. Around noon, Sheriff Tom Walker rode into the yard with 2 deputies. He dismounted quickly, studying the damage. "I heard gunfire all the way from Red Creek," he said. Emma nodded. "The Carson gang came." The sheriff looked around. "And somehow, you're both still standing." He turned toward Luke. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then the sheriff removed his hat. "I recognize you." Luke gave a slight nod. "It's been a long time. I thought you disappeared forever." "I almost did." The sheriff sighed. "People still tell stories about you." "I don't believe stories. I believe what I see." He looked at the shattered fence posts and the untouched cabin. One man held off 8 outlaws. Luke simply shrugged. "They made poor choices." The sheriff smiled. "I've got deputies searching every trail. Carson won't stay hidden forever." Luke's expression remained calm. "He won't run." "You think he'll come back?" "He'll want revenge." The sheriff nodded grimly. "So will I." That afternoon, the townspeople began arriving one by one. Old Mr. Jenkins brought lumber. Mrs. Miller arrived with fresh bread and blankets. Several ranchers repaired fencing without being asked. One young boy shyly handed Emma a small bouquet of wildflowers. My mama says heroes shouldn't feel lonely. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. For years she had believed she was forgotten. Now she realized people had always cared.
You got
They
it?
had simply
right
been
there.
waiting for
We're here to
someone
help,
brave
Emma.
enough to stand
Thank you,
beside
Tom.
her.
Thank you, everyone. Looks
That
better
someone
already.
had been Luke.
Yeah, we'll get there.
I
As
hope
evening
so.
settled across the valley, Emma and Luke sat quietly beside a small campfire. The stars slowly appeared overhead. Neither spoke for a while. Finally Emma broke the silence. You've spent years helping strangers. Luke stared into the flames. Sometimes. Why? He took a long breath. Because once. I couldn't save the people who needed me most. Emma looked at him gently. It wasn't your fault. I believed it was. The guilt never left? No. Emma placed another log on the fire. My husband used to tell me something. Luke looked up. He said carrying yesterday only makes tomorrow heavier. Luke remained silent. But this time, his silence wasn't filled with pain. It was filled with thought. Boone suddenly lifted his head and growled. Luke stood immediately. Far across the prairie, tiny lights moved through the darkness. Not lanterns. Campfires. Someone had made camp on the ridge overlooking the ranch. Luke narrowed his eyes. There. Emma followed his gaze. The Carson gang? Yes. They're waiting. For sunrise. Emma felt her stomach tighten. What do we do? Luke looked toward the ranch, then toward the distant town. This time. He calmly loaded fresh cartridges into his Winchester. We finish it. The wind carried the faint echo of horses across the moonlit prairie. The final confrontation was only hours away.
Hold
The
it right
first
there,
light
Carson.
of dawn
We ain't
stretched
stopping,
across the
Luke.
prairie as a
Drop
cool
your
breeze
weapons.
swept over
Sheriff!
Emma Carter's
Walker!
ranch.
Surrender now!
The sky glowed
It's
orange
over!
behind the distant mountains, but the peaceful sunrise could not hide the danger riding toward them. Luke stood beside the front gate, his Winchester resting calmly in his hands. Emma tightened the strap on Samuel's revolver and took a deep breath. Boone stood between them, ears raised, watching the ridge. A cloud of dust slowly appeared. The Carson gang was coming. This time, Carson rode at the front with 6 remaining outlaws. Their faces showed anger more than confidence. They had returned not for land, but for revenge. Luke stepped into the open yard. I'll give you one last chance, he called. Ride away. Carson laughed bitterly. You've taken enough from me. I took nothing. You ruined my gang. You ruined it yourself. The outlaw's face twisted with rage. Fire. The gang charged. Gunshots echoed across the valley. Luke moved with incredible speed, ducking behind a wagon before returning 2 perfectly aimed shots. One shattered a rifle barrel. The other knocked a revolver from an outlaw's hand. Emma stayed behind the corral fence, protecting the cattle while watching for anyone trying to circle the barn. Remembering Luke's calm example, she waited for the right moment instead of firing wildly. One outlaw raced toward the cabin. Emma stepped out, took careful aim, and fired. The bullet struck the wooden post beside his saddle, startling his horse. The frightened animal turned sharply, throwing its rider into a muddy water trough. Luke glanced toward Emma and gave a small nod of approval. Her confidence grew. Carson, seeing his men losing ground again, drew a second revolver and rode straight toward Luke. The 2 men faced each other in the middle of the ranch. For a heartbeat, everything seemed still. Then Carson fired. Luke spun aside, the bullet missing by inches. In one smooth motion, he raised his own revolver and fired a single shot. Carson's revolver flew from his hand, landing in the dirt. Before Carson could reach for another weapon, Sheriff Tom Walker's voice thundered across the prairie. Drop your weapons. The
Drop your
sheriff and a
weapons,
dozen
Carson.
mounted deputies
We
burst over the
surrender.
nearby hill. The outlaws froze. They were surrounded. Seeing no escape, one by one they tossed their rifles and revolvers onto the ground. Carson looked around desperately. His gang was beaten. His horses were boxed in. The sheriff rode forward and climbed from his saddle. "It's over, Carson." For a long moment, Carson stared at Luke. "You could have killed me." Luke answered quietly. "Justice lasts longer than revenge." Carson lowered his head. The deputies bound the outlaws' hands and led them away toward Red Creek. As the last wagon disappeared over the hill, the ranch finally fell silent. Emma looked around at the peaceful valley. The fear that had haunted her home for weeks was gone. For the first time since Samuel's passing, she felt truly safe. Luke looked toward the distant mountains as if preparing to leave once more. Emma watched him carefully. She had a feeling this wasn't the end of his journey. A week passed, and the Carter Ranch slowly came back to life.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
The
It is,
broken
Emma.
fences had been rebuilt.
Welcome home.
Fresh paint covered the front porch, new shingles protected the barn roof, and healthy cattle once again grazed peacefully across the green pasture. The laughter of neighbors echoed through the valley as everyone helped restore what the Carson gang had tried to destroy. Emma could hardly believe how much had changed. For years, she had carried every burden alone. Now, every morning someone stopped by to lend a hand or simply share a kind word. The ranch no longer felt forgotten, it had become part of a community again. Luke had remained during the repairs, though he never asked for thanks. He worked quietly from sunrise until dusk, fixing fences, mending wagon wheels, and helping the neighboring ranchers who had also suffered from the gang's raids. The townspeople had begun to look at him differently. To them, he wasn't a ghost. He was a good man. One warm afternoon, Sheriff Tom Walker rode to the ranch carrying a leather satchel. He climbed down from his horse and smiled. "Good news." Emma looked up from feeding the chickens. "The judge sentenced Carson and the rest of his gang this morning." She breathed a sigh of relief. "So, it's really over?" "It is." The sheriff turned toward Luke. "They also asked me to give you this." He handed Luke a polished silver marshal's badge. "The territory wants you back." Luke looked at the badge for a long moment. Years ago, wearing one had filled him with pride. Later, it had reminded him only of loss. Now it represented something different. A second chance. The sheriff smiled. "You've still got the respect of every lawman around here." Luke gently closed the satchel and handed it back. "I appreciate it. But my place isn't chasing outlaws anymore." The sheriff nodded with understanding. "I thought you might say that." He tipped his hat to Emma before riding back toward Red Creek. That evening, the prairie glowed beneath a brilliant sunset. Golden light stretched across the hills as Emma and Luke sat on the porch with cups of hot coffee. Boone slept peacefully at their feet. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Luke stood. "I should leave tomorrow." Emma looked at him quietly. "Why?" "I've stayed longer than I planned. This ranch wouldn't still be standing without you. You don't need me anymore." Emma smiled softly. "I think you're wrong." Luke looked across the pasture. "The danger's gone." "Yes. You'll be safe." "I will." He picked up his saddlebag. Emma's heart
It's beautiful,
sank.
Luke.
She had
It is,
already
Emma.
lost one man she
Home.
loved. She wasn't ready to lose another. Before Luke could walk away, she spoke. "You once asked why I refused to leave this ranch." Luke stopped. "You said this land held Samuel's memory." "It does." She stepped closer. "But memories aren't meant to keep us from living." Luke slowly turned toward her. Emma smiled through tears. This ranch was built with love. She looked around the peaceful valley. And I think love deserves another chance. For the first time in many years, Luke's guarded expression softened completely. You really want an old drifter staying around? Emma laughed. I was thinking more about a partner. Luke looked toward Boone. The old sheepdog wagged his tail as if already approving the decision. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers across the prairie. Luke removed his saddlebag from his shoulder and placed it back on the porch. I suppose. A faint smile appeared beneath the brim of his hat. I could stay a little longer. Emma smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. Months later, spring arrived on the frontier. The Carter Ranch became one of the strongest in the valley. Travelers often stopped there for a warm meal, a safe night's rest, and a friendly welcome. Children from neighboring ranches loved listening to Luke's stories by the campfire, though he always left out the parts that made him sound like a legend. To them, he wasn't the Ghost Gunslinger. He was simply Luke. The quiet man who fixed broken fences. Who protected the weak. Who believed mercy was stronger than revenge. And who finally found the one thing he had been searching for all those lonely years. A place to call home. The end.